that is quite an interesting question, isn't it? Because I find it something that I've popped into and out of, I suppose, through the years. And probably the first time that I had anything to do with it, without realizing what was going on, was probably in the early 50s, when I used to have I had a holiday job from school with a man called Ray Woodman, who was a carpenter, funnily enough, and we used to go and do various jobs around the place. And one of the earliest jobs we ever did was to build temperature-controlled compartments for the mercury delay lines of EDSAC. That's what was then the mathematical laboratory.
Okay.
So for the time that we were building these ovens, controlled temperature storage tanks, we were very much in contact with EDSAC. But I didn't realize until a long time afterwards, when I read a very interesting book about the history of EDSAC and its connection with the Lyons Electronic Office, Lyons being big tea rooms in those days, you may remember. Wasn't until I read that I realized that we had actually played a part in this project. At the end of his second or third year, he decided to go with his father on an attempt to cross the Atlantic in a balloon, which I think must have been over the Christmas period of 1959. Yes, I think 59. And so he set off to go across the Atlantic in a balloon. They stayed up, I think, for 94.5 hours, but they did, in the end, have to ditch in the sea and pedal their way to Bermuda or wherever it was. There's a book about it called The Cruise of the Small World, because the Small World was the name of the balloon. And he was allowed to come back and finish his 4-year chemical engineering course. And one of the things that he devised while he was doing this was the idea that became Cambridge Consultants, because he was given a project to, I think, look at a paper mill or paper. Yes, it'd be a paper production line, which of course is a very long machine, to look at it and evaluate it and see whether anything could be done to improve anything about it, which could be the process or the equipment or the way things were done, anything like that. Very open project. And he felt that there was a place for the brains of Cambridge University to be let out to the problems of industry, and thus the idea of Cambridge Consultants was born. And he called a lunch meeting at his somewhat small rooms at Ram Yard, which in those days was one of the ramshackle little yards off the centre of Cambridge, off in the centre of Cambridge. So I went to the meeting when he unveiled his idea. So I do count myself as being one of the founders of Cambridge Consultants, because not long after that we got together and started doing things, perhaps not very concentratedly, but at least we made a start on it. And a lot of the early work that Cambridge Consultants did consisted of George Sassoon, who was a very multi-talented man, translating papers for what was then the British Welding Research Association, BWRA, from Russian into English, so that it wasn't very like the work that he'd thought that a firm such as Cambridge Consultants might do, but at least it made a start and brought some money in so that we could at least imagine that we were training ourselves to be Cambridge Consultants. I think just because I happened to be there at the right moment, you know, that I wasn't selected to be an important part of the jigsaw. I just happened to be there. And one of the first jobs I did, which again was not really like the sort of thing that Cambridge Consultants thought it was going to do, the first job I did was to source a kit of parts in order to build an electric fire. I think for a man in Linton or somewhere, a local man anyway, who wanted to build electric fires, and he wanted somebody to find where to get this bit and that bit and the other bit. So it might be a reflector or an insulator or a knob or a switch, in order to produce the kit of parts to make to make the fires. Not, as I say, very like the sort of work that Cambridge Consultants thought it was going to do. It wasn't terribly technical, but it was a job and we did it. Well, no, we were scrabbling around trying to find what work we could, and some of the early work, one piece of early work I think was for what was then called the Board of Trade, and it was a press to squeeze a pile of papers together and then glue one edge so that it made a number of pads on which you could write an order or whatever it might be, and it would make a copy of it and you tear it off and hand it around. But it was just known as the padding press. It wasn't a highly technical thing. It was really an engineering job. Well, I actually joined it full-time in 1953 and left in 1976. I think it was driven very much by Tim, but at the same time he was a bit of a Catherine wheel, you know. He needed harnessing quite drastically, and felt that they needed to get away to Cambridge Consultants. Because it was quite a long time before Cambridge Consultants actually did anything useful. You know, it had plenty of aspirations about the brains of the university and the problems of industry and all that, but well, it does sound a bit chaotic to suggest that people at Pi had job titles and some idea of what they were supposed to be doing, whereas Cambridge Consultants just happened, really. But C.O. Stanley got to Pi's, I think, around the mid-20s. So that I don't know whether it was better planned than we were, but it did seem to have some idea of what it was doing. The Pi bit that I worked for was cathodian. Tim Eilowart, who I've mentioned before and will probably mention again, was always very interested in trying to measure things, such as how good an entrepreneur a person might be, or, for example. And he met a Cambridge psychologist called Alice Heim, and she had been devising what might be described as intelligence tests, which was the AH for Alice Heim series of tests. And I don't know how it was that Tim came across AH5, which was I think the latest in Alice Heim's productions, but he put a lot of faith in that test, and in fact at the time administered most of the people that he could persuade to take it. And I don't know how he met Clive Sinclair at that time, but he did give AH5 to Clive Sinclair in the very early days, and I think he scored 52 out of whatever it was. So Tim thought he must be a good bloke, and I don't know what the detail of it was really, but Clive was, I suppose, a well-known writer of electronic texts at that time, working for Bernard's radio manuals, and then he started working with F.J. Cam, if that rings a bell. F.J. Cam being the brother of, I think, Sidney Cam, who designed the Spitfire. And he also, F.J. Cam had magazines called Practical Wireless and Practical Television and so on. And for some time, Clive became an important writer for Practical Wireless. And something must have happened around that time which encouraged Clive to design a miniature radio and to set up his purveyorship of kits of parts for building micro amplifiers. He called it. It would sit on a half crown. It was very small, if you remember a half crown, and a miniature radio and everything miniature. And that was the foundation of Clive's business at that time, which was selling kits of parts. And he wanted somebody to assemble and dispatch the kits of parts. And it must have been about the time when Tim had encouraged him to take AH5, so he was very much to the fore at that moment. And Tim said, why don't you let us assemble and dispatch your kits of parts? And Clive said, thank you very much, and came along to the Cambridge Consultants' premises to do that. Cambridge Consultants discovered Enderby's Mill and rented it, and then Clive wanted premises for a workshop, for bits of workshopy stuff, and so he had part of Enderby's Mill, and we had a bit of it for Cambridge Consultants. It was all very muddly, but fun, as I have tried to convey. And I can't remember what happened particularly. It must have been about 70, I suppose, when we discovered Enderby's Mill. That was plenty of space for doing things. But, oh yes, Clive got more and more floors of Enderby's Mill and had a wonderful office on looking out over the river and that sort of thing. Well, it so happened at Cambridge Consultants that I was concerned with a method of making carpet by a new method. We set up in partnership with a carpet making company in Durham called Hugh Mackay, and because we were in Cambridge and they were in Durham, the company that we started was called Durham. And there was a very considerable building on the premises at the St Ives Mill, which we took over as Durham Hall, we called it, and did our experimental work on Durham there. That would have been about 1970-ish, I think. I had a fairly rudimentary design and print company in Histon Road, and at the back of this company there was a bakehouse, because it had been a grocer's shop with a bakery attached, and I had let the bakehouse at the back to Cambridge Consultants in order to set up their first workshop. So there was that, which was sending out the assembling and sending out the kits. And then next door was my rudimentary printing works, which was printing material for Sinclair. I think it was Sinclair Radionics at that time. But anyway, whatever one needed as a instruction sheet on how to put it together, or rather naughtily was an order to print 1,000 cards saying we're very sorry but we've run out of stocks of whatever it is, because one of the early practices was to collect orders to get the money to buy the bits to make the kits that the orders were for. And well, it wasn't always with malice aforethought, but another of the problems that existed at that time was finding finance for commercial enterprises, so that rather than setting yourself up with a lot of capital and then starting to trade, the only way you could get money was by selling whatever it was first and then getting the bits together afterwards. It wasn't a sort of deliberate bad practice. It was just the way that it was possible to make things happen. I think it was just a friendship, yes. Friendship. We were all people who knew each other and used to, I don't know quite what time it was that we tended to go out for lunch every Saturday at the Plough at Fenditon, but it was a sort of loose group of friends. David Southard and Don Casey. You haven't come across Don Casey. Colin Fisher. He was doing a PhD at Cambridge, and he was also doing some design work for Cambridge Consultants on the side, but he had to be careful not to let his Cambridge people know that he was working on the side for... that was because it was interesting, you know, it wasn't sort of a way of pulling wool over their eyes or anything. It was just trying to make life happen without anybody complaining about it to anybody else. Well, of course, it really started with this Sack and Leah project, which would be, I suppose, in the late 50s, or maybe even the early 50s. But there were not lots of people around doing electronic things, as one imagines there probably were later. Because it wasn't, I think it wasn't planned that A, B and C will get together and we've got this, that and the other skills, and we'll devise something to do, whatever it might be, and get a product, and there'll be a new company. It wasn't like that at all. Well, right at the very beginning, it was all very difficult because there was the relationship between Cambridge and industry, so that the planning department, for instance, didn't look particularly smilingly upon the idea of Cambridge consultants and premises that it might have somewhere. We did, in fact, find a couple of houses in Histon Road, which became Cambridge consultants. But there was never, I think, any blessing to our presence there, and they wanted to get rid of us as quickly as they could. And there was also, of course, the whole financial climate was quite different then, going back again to 1960-ish. The idea that there was venture capital around and money to be invested and hope something would come out of the other end of it and all that sort of thing. It was a completely different atmosphere from what you can now imagine. I've brought this book, a computer called Leo. Leo standing for Lyons Electronic Office.
Okay.
Because the firm Lyons, very early on, realized the potential of a machine which we now call a computer for stock control and ordering and all the various things that a multi-branch tea shop needed in order to run its business.
Okay.
And Lyons Electronic Office, now I can't remember what that turned into, but anyway, it was a computer called Leo, and one of the things later on was that Leo was the Leo project was looking for computer programmers, and I did go along to a session which I didn't really understand what it was about, but it was to see whether I was suitable to be a programmer, and luckily I was, but I didn't ever take them up on the offer. Well, a lot of it was happening in what was then called the Mathematical Laboratory in Cambridge, which is where Ed Sack lived. Later on, of course, they got rid of Ed Sack in order to set up for a more comprehensive computer, and I can't remember what it was called, possibly Titan or one of those. And in order to clear the space to get the new computer in, they invited people to take bits of Ed Sack away, and the bit that I got was I think it was Arithmetical Unit 1, which is now here in this collection of computer history.